All right, let's get this discussion underway now. The incoming government, which will be made up of different political parties, has sparked debate on what kind of a society is envisaged under the new administration. The ANC, along with 9 others, have agreed to form a government of national unity after no single party obtained more than 50% nationally. Now, in last month's vote, let's speak now about this, and we are joined by political analyst Professor Stephen Friedman. We're also joined by former public protector and social justice chairperson Professor Thuli Madonsela, and we're also joined by the organization Undoing Tax Abuses CEO Wayne Duvenage. To all my guests, good evening to you, and thank you very much for your time. Professor Friedman, I'd like to kick off the discussion with you and ask whether the public should start to panic when we read in the papers that there are threats by a party with a sizable number of MPs, such as the Democratic Alliance, that they may pull out of this if the ANC continues in the manner in which it is as regards the dividing of cabinet posts?
No, I don't think we should panic, Golly. Look, I think it's inevitable that, you played a clip from General Holomisa, and I would agree, I would disagree with him on some other things, but I would certainly agree with him that 2 weeks to get together this kind of coalition government. This is not a government of national unity. I think one has to keep on saying, I'm puzzled that media, who are supposed to not take what politicians say at face value, simply repeat that this is a government of national unity when it has none of the features of the government of national unity. It's essentially a coalition between the ANC and the Democratic Alliance, in which the IFP as a third party is also important, because if the IFP is not part of the coalition, then the coalition loses control of KwaZulu-Natal. But that is essentially what it is. And the idea that parties which have been fighting with each other for 20 years are going to find each other within 2 weeks, I agree, is absolutely unrealistic and ridiculous. So given that we are faced with a situation where parties are forced to find each other, you're going to have a lot of grandstanding on both sides. You're going to have a lot of brinksmanship, and I think that's inevitably part of the process. The reality is that there's no alternative to this at the moment. If the DA loses this, then the ANC's only option, I guess, would be to explore a coalition with the MK party, which the DA fought the election on avoiding. And I think the ANC has limited options because there are significant sections of the ANC which would not tolerate a coalition with the MK party. A coalition between the ANC and the EFF doesn't have a majority. Would have to cobble together a very unstable coalition. So I think what we're seeing at the moment is parties engaging in brinksmanship with the knowledge that really, they have to carry on with this thing whether they like it or not, and they try to get the best deal that they can for themselves and their members with that in mind. Sure.
All right. So that's a good starting point. Professor Madonsela, as I come to you, Professor Stephen Friedman talks about the political brinkmanship that we are seeing on display right now. Where does that put the stability of the country? And need I say more about an economy that needs to grow so that people have jobs?
Well, thank you. I do agree with my colleague, Prof. Stephen Friedman, that there is a bit of brinkmanship, which is expected, partly because of the history of our polarized history. But also, I think leaders should have started to talk a little bit earlier. We were aware that it was quite unlikely that the ANC would get a majority. What we were not aware of was that the movement of people would not be to the right, that is DA, etc. The movement would be to the left, which was the MK party is the main reason the ANC shed votes. From 57%, the MK party took 15 percentage points, and then a few independents and other small parties also took some of the ANC. So we will require a bit of humility, and I think perhaps they might need facilitation by a wise person, an elderly person, or a retired judge that they trust, to just keep their tempers level. And also, don't always go to the public with the bickering. Just stay together with the language and only go to the public with maybe joint statements about where the process is and what they're still trying to iron out. And lastly, they just have to firstly accept the Constitution. And I agree with General Holomesa that they started at the wrong place about who wants what positions. I think the starting point should be, does everybody who is part of the GNU accept the Constitution in its entirety? Because I think part of the problem is you don't want to give a ministry, a strategic ministry, to somebody who doesn't accept the Constitution, particularly the fact that it is a transformative blueprint that is not here to cement and legitimize inequality. It's a transformative blueprint on the basis of which a new society that is based on equality must be built.
Yeah. Let's come to you, Wayne Duvenage. At the end of the day, what the people of South Africa want is an ethical government. And this is what your organization on a day-to-day basis is seized with, fighting the unethical elements within the state. The bigger this GNU grows, I'm now conflicted as to what to call it, because Professor Friedman says this is not a GNU. The bigger this GNU grows, is there a risk that the ethical element is going to be lost?
Yeah, look, the bigger it grows, the more cumbersome it does get. And I agree with Professor Friedman. This is a coalition. It is a very large coalition, and it's going to be a challenging one because, as he said, they've been competing for years, and now they have to work together. And we certainly hope that they have some dispute resolution mechanisms in place, or people to calm the heads down and to help people just deal with these differences. I agree we should not be fighting this in the public, or the bickering and the disagreement should not be aired in public. You know, then they really need to resolve their differences behind closed doors and do a lot more joint announcements as opposed to threats, as we've heard from time to time, that, you know, if this doesn't happen, then we may pull out. This is not what we need now. We need stability. We need to move forward, as difficult as it is, and get the solutions that we need as a country, which is our economy up, dealing with poverty, dealing with inequality, and dealing with our economy.
Professor Stephen Friedman, now that we have dealt with the politics of the day, the topic of discussion here today has to do with the kind of society we want, or at least we are hoping for, out of this GNU. Are you able to put that into perhaps key points of discussion that you think are top of mind right now?
Well, Corey, I wouldn't be arrogant enough to say that I know what the people of South Africa think. The people of South Africa think a great many things, and I think that we should always be careful not to assume that what we think is what the people think.
Yeah.
But if you were to ask me, as somebody who studies this country, what I think we need at the moment, I would argue it's very clear what we need at the moment. Most of our problems are caused by the fact that in 1994, we negotiated one huge change, which we needed to negotiate. And I certainly agree with Advocate Professor Madonsela that the Constitution is a very important part of maintaining democracy in this country. But there were a whole lot of things we did not negotiate in 1994. We didn't negotiate access to the economy. We didn't negotiate all sorts of arrangements which mean that a bright young person growing up in a township is much less likely to make it in the economy than a person growing up in the suburbs. We didn't address the effect of race and race relations on our economy and our society. And that's what we need to do now. Now, to me, the most interesting part of the agreement which set up this coalition government is that you will be aware that there is a clause in there which talks about a national dialogue. Now, I don't want to split hairs. I think we need a national negotiation rather than national dialogue, but we may or may not get into that. Now, I think the reason they've put that dialogue there is that it's going to enable them to govern for the next few years. Because the way it's going to work is this, that, if you're talking about many of the things that upset citizens, making sure that there's adequate water, making sure that the lights stay on, making sure that people are protected from crime. I don't think there's disagreement among the three parties on that issue. What there is huge disagreement on them is precisely some of these big issues: national health insurance, affirmative action, those sorts of issues. And I think what the parties are going to do is they're going to say, look, we don't have to settle those issues now because we've got a national dialogue which can deal with that. And that may seem like kicking it down the road, but it could be a very positive development. Because if the effect of that is to get people in the room, people from business, people from labor, professional associations, to really start to thrash out how we can make this an economy which works for everybody, how we can make this a society which works for everybody, then it could be a tremendous step forward. So, can I draw an exact picture of what society we're looking for? But we're certainly looking for a society where anybody in this country who has energy and talent can advance in the economy, and we don't have that at the moment. Yeah. We are talking about a society in which people who've been discriminated against since, for centuries feel that they can flourish and they can grow in the institutions. And I think we're only going to get there through negotiation. And although I think that this national dialogue has been put there in order to solve a problem for the political parties, I think that we as citizens can make sure that it operates in our favor by putting pressure on the politicians to actually look at the real issues that they tend to duck in the day-to-day politics of the country. There's a lot to do there, but there would be tremendous benefits for the society if we started grappling with those issues.
Yeah. Professor Matonsela, there's one point out of the many that Professor Friedman has touched on, but I suppose one that stands out for me right now is what he says, that we didn't negotiate access to the economy, and that appears to be the political lexicon of the day, economic freedom in our lifetime, which is why we even have a party that is named after such. Was this a terrible blind spot by those who were negotiating at that time?
No, Tolly. Firstly, I agree with everything that Prof. Friedman has said, 100%, including the fact that there was no economic deal, there was no land deal as well. It wasn't a blind spot, and I've seen people writing their PhDs with the assumption that Mandela and them thought we had suddenly miraculously become a rainbow nation of equality. It's not true. It was kicking the ball downstream, so to speak, because there was a need to reach some agreement as a basis for a regularized environment. I was speaking about Nelson Mandela having said to the community of Santa Monica in the US that we are not yet equal. All we have achieved is freedom not to be oppressed. And he goes down later and explains that there are two freedoms, basically, that were achieved in the run-up to 1994, political freedom and legal freedom. So nobody can now oppress you with the power of the law, and nobody can exclude you from political participation with the power of the law. That was supposed to give us space then for the second deal, which was the economic deal and the social deal, which includes the land question.
Wayne Duvenage, we are not yet equal, and there are policies abound trying to equalize this society, and that's why policies such as BEE came into being. But we have reports upon media reports that talk to how this has not been properly done. What can we do to get it right?
Sure, that's the big debate and the work that has to be done, because we certainly haven't dealt with the inequality. People are trapped, communities are trapped in poverty for far too long, and we have to rectify this. And it's going to take, it's a combination of education. I think we've let our people down when we look at the extent of our youth coming through school or not coming through as employable. We're wasting money on the skills development levies. We're not using those funds or getting the return on that investment. I think it's just a tick box exercise from business to pay their 1% skills development levies. Nobody's forcing government to make sure that that investment is wisely spent and wisely dealt with. So there's so many angles to this. And if we don't rectify it, we are just going to be beating this drum for the next 30 years. And so this is a leadership issue. But what we have done to date has not worked. The BE, the BBBEE process has really made a handful of people very wealthy, and it certainly hasn't distributed wealth or brought people into the mainstream economy. And I'm talking, when I say people, the vast majority of South Africans.
Mm. Professor Friedman, I don't want for this discussion to be so high level that I get lost in it. So I'd like to deal with the sphere of government that I think people experience the most, and that is local government. There has been so much failure in that space that people lose faith. Right now, we're about to have water at least rationed because there needs to be fixes. It talks to one of the many fixes that need to be done. What is it that can be done to reassure society that things are being repaired, the infrastructure is being repaired, so that we don't lose hope? I hope I've explained this well enough in a form of a question.
No, I don't want to give the impression that anything I'm saying is abstract. I mean, when you talk about people not being able to put food on the table because there are all sorts of barriers in the economy, there's nothing abstract about that. You know, we came through COVID-19, and what happened after COVID-19 is that middle-class people, because they have the resources, actually got back on their feet very quickly. Throughout this country, there are households who are still living with the devastation which was imposed on them in COVID-19. So that's just one indication of very concrete reality. And what I think needs, I distinguish, when I talk about things that need to be changed, we're obviously talking about policy questions and programs. But there is also, as I said at the beginning, there is also the hard work of making sure that people get the basic services they're entitled to. I haven't done any work on this election, but certainly my impression of the 2021 local election, in which the ANC went below 50% for the first time, is that a major reason it went below 50% was water. People not getting access to good, clean drinking water, which they obviously need. So, that's a fairly basic issue you're talking about. And I think on those issues, there is, I think you're correct to imply that there's a trust problem. I think people have lost trust. I think people don't trust politicians, and politicians have to win that trust back. And there are two ways you win the trust back, very basically. The first one is by your actions. The first one is actually doing what you say you're going to do, and getting down there and getting your hands dirty. But the equally important one, in my view, is actually listening to people. And I think our politicians in the main are very bad at listening to people. They make these lofty speeches about what people want. But you don't say what people want unless you've actually gone out there and listened to them tell you what they want. And I think we need far more of that. And what I'm hopeful about is that, we're now in a new era in our politics, and I don't think we should, minimize that. It's an important change in our politics that happened at this election. We are now in a situation, very obviously, more than any time in our history, where politicians really need to listen to citizens, because they're going to lose lots of votes if they don't. And hopefully, if that message sinks through, we will not have less politicians making high-flown statements and more politicians actually getting out to shack settlements, to townships, to places where most people live, because people in the suburbs are able to pick up a phone and actually get politicians to listen to them. Whether they're satisfied with the outcome is another debate. But don't try that in the townships, and that's what has to change.
Yeah. Professor Matonsela, let's get you to also weigh in on the local government sphere. The basic delivery of services, would that be a good starting point for a South African society that slowly regains confidence in their government?
Absolutely. Only it would have to be one of the starting points. My only contribution, though, to this would be the silver bullet approach is one of the reasons we're in this mess. When a poor white problem was diagnosed starting from about 1840, when the Dutch Synod identified it, but then a group of academics eventually came together in the 1920s, and then with the help of the Carnegie Commission came up with a report in 1932. They took a systems approach to society. That society is a system, and when you have a problem, and the problem identified was poverty, white poverty, they didn't say, oh, education. In fact, they looked at education and found that it was one of the factors that was impacting on white poverty, but it was not the only factor. Lack of access to land because of mass agriculture, low pay. For example, this whole idea of growth will automatically end poverty. No, that's not true. During those years, there was growth because of the mines and mass agriculture, but it came with underdevelopment and poverty of both blacks and white. But the solution then was to develop whites at the expense of blacks. So they looked at education, they looked at what parastatals could do, SOEs. They looked at social life, and etc. And therefore, going forward, yes, let's fix local government. Let's use local government as Cities Alliance advises as an engine of social upliftment plus economic upliftment, but still within a systems approach where we fix things like land. I don't know why we keep avoiding land. Land doesn't grow, so your growth and development approach does not apply to land. But again, going back to a conference I just attended in Vilnius, growth can still be toxic. Let's say, for example, one movie we watched there is called The Grab, where people, syndicates from all over the world, very organized syndicates, buy all the land in countries so that they can control access to food, they can control access to water. So if that money gets pumped into South Africa, we would see growth. But it would not be smart growth, and it would certainly not be growth with sustainable development. It would be growth that is linked to state capture by a syndicate that would use water and food to control us. So my advice to these guys that are going to govern us is put the Constitution first. 2, involve the people. I like Prof. Friedman's approach that says, open this, maybe not necessarily waiting for the dialogue, but the negotiations themselves, if you make them a certain level of them transparent, but take into account what Wayne has said, is that don't tell us about your disagreement. Just give us, these broad statements about what are you talking about so that we can submit ideas to you.
Yeah.
But everything based on the Constitution and everything based on agreeing on what are your shared values. What kind of society are you building? And I want to say the Constitution is very clear. It's a society of equals. It's a society where there's healed divisions of the past, where there's social justice, fundamental human rights, and democratic values, and where everyone's potential is freed and everyone's life is improved.
You're watching News at Prime, and we are discussing the society that ordinary South Africans want or wish for. And still with me for this discussion is political analyst Professor Stephen Friedman, former public protector and social justice chairperson, Professor Thuli Madonsela, and the CEO of the organization Undoing Tax Abuse, OUTA for short, Wayne Duvenage. Mr. Duvenage, I want to pick up with you. We normally say that municipalities or local government is the coal face of delivery of services to the people. But these are dysfunctional, these municipalities. They are crisis prone. If that's the case, is there something wrong perhaps with the financial model of these municipalities where they are hamstrung on delivering services, or is it just pure corruption?
Yeah, well, it's a combination of corruption and maladministration. So I think the quick answer to this is, if you just go back 15 years, many of the municipalities that are now dysfunctional were very functional. And but what has happened is they've lost their way. We've been calling for zero-based budgeting for some time, because what happens is municipalities get stuck in this trap and they don't really clear the decks. They don't have an introspective look at exactly where things are going wrong. Wipe the slate clean. They have this ability to just pass on the costs to their residents and push up the rates and taxes and push up the margins on the electricity tariffs and so on. And you can't keep doing that, because eventually you get it's not sustainable, and the cost of just paying the taxes to the municipalities becomes more than the bonds that people have to take out, and the youth just get left behind because they just cannot get into buying and owning property or houses or residential places of living. So look, this is where we experience life in our towns and our cities. This is where we go to school, to our places of worship. We recreate, we do everything in the local government space. To think that there's not enough money, we think that that's not necessarily the case. You can take a cross-section of towns and cities across the country, and you'll find very similar towns in size and industry. And you'll find that one city or town is worse off than the other, and that's mismanagement of funds largely. And we believe that government needs to try and step in here, because although there's the executive powers that local government have, you've got to be very careful not to usurp those. There's a lot of grants that are pumped in at a national level, and we are seeing that money is being wasted, and unnecessarily so. We've got a lot of work to do to right the wrongs of the past, to make sure that money flows, not just doesn't stay in the residential areas that pay the rates and taxes. You have to get the infrastructure into the poorer areas, but you have to manage that very carefully. You have to plan long term. We're not seeing enough long-term planning, and we're not seeing enough maintenance of our infrastructure. And when you stop maintaining, it takes a lot of funds to rebuild that infrastructure. And unfortunately, we've waited too long, especially on our water infrastructure, roads infrastructure, and electricity. It's getting out of hand now.
Yeah. Whilst on you prompt the question of electricity, Professor Friedman, This is another area of anxiety, I think, is the word I would choose to use, for South Africans. We have a new administration that is coming through. Before then, we had this cynical view that load shedding had been stopped because there was an election upon us. The elections have come and gone. The electricity provision, at least it remains in place for now. How anxious should we be as society that the government finally is getting things right as far as electricity provision is concerned?
Well, I'm puzzled. Why should we be anxious if the government gets something right? Shouldn't we be anxious if they get something wrong? Why should we be anxious about this? You see, I think there's something a bit more important going on here. And a lot has gone wrong over the last few years, and I can understand that. But I think that if you're going to hold government to account, you have to base your holding government to account to the facts. And I don't think that always happens. So that's a very good example. If you listened carefully at the time to people who really understand electricity provision, and unfortunately part of the problem is that not everybody who speaks about electricity provision really understands it, but the people who've done careful research, etc., they would have told you that the reason load shedding stopped was because there'd actually been a lot of people had moved to solar power, which made it easier for Eskom to manage the provision. And secondly, there were actually substantial improvements in efficiency at power stations. That doesn't mean, and Eskom have made that clear, and the minister has made that clear, that doesn't mean we're out of the woods yet and that we can say goodbye to load shedding. But thank heaven, so far, we've been without load shedding for quite some time. And I think part of holding government to account in these situations is that when they get it right, we should say they get it right, and we should encourage them to carry on getting it right. So I think hopefully one of the consequences of having a coalition government is that we will have a more even-handed and a more balanced approach to this. As a Democrat, I'm all for giving government a hard time if the evidence shows that they're doing the wrong thing. Yeah. But I'm equally concerned that we should have, we should not simply assume that everything government does is wrong, which turns out usually to be as bad as assuming that everything government does is right.
Before I move to Professor Madonsela, whilst on the electricity question, Professor Friedman, do you think the electricity ministry should remain whilst we have an energy crisis?
Well, I mean, Gordie, the fact of the matter is, look, there have been substantial improvements at Eskom. The fact of the matter is that, when this minister took over, we were at stage 6, and now we've had 3 months without load shedding. And there's an old cliche which says, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And clearly, unless things start, if things start coming apart, then obviously this minister will have to account if he remains the minister. We don't know what to, but whoever replaces him if he doesn't remain the minister. But clearly having a dedicated Minister of Electricity has had a positive impact. So clearly we must keep it until, if we're able to, which would be wonderful, until we're able to conclude that our energy supply is now secure and you don't need a minister. I think it makes a lot of sense to retain either this minister or whoever the coalition government decides to replace him with.
Professor Madonsela, a completely different topic for you. Rail and public transport. Essentially, it's public transport, whether you use rail or road. Point is, people need transport to get to work. How well or badly has the government of the day done since 1994?
Well, there was some improvement in rail transport and public transport for a while, until somehow during the state capture years, Prasa and Transnet became part of the attack. And then Also just poor appointments to our ports and some of the transport entities may have contributed to the challenge. Another contributor to the mess we're in, particularly with rail, was how the security of train stations was managed during COVID-19. And I must say something here that might come across as controversial to the high priests of privatization. During apartheid, the rail system had its own rail police, and all over the world it had rail police. During my time as pub protector, this had now been outsourced to security companies, and we picked up some irregularities and sometimes corruption to this. Now the problem is if you get rid of a tender of a company that was looking after your rail infrastructure, you now have unemployed people that have secrets and access to these systems. So I would say this partnership between government at the moment is looking at infrastructure, fixing the ports, fixing the rails, etc. Fixing security is one of them, and then water is another, and electricity is one of those. That should continue, but a permanent solution should be around thinking about not outsourcing core responsibilities of the state.
You watching News at Prime, and we at the tail end of a discussion about the kind of society South Africans want or wish for. Let's come to you, Wayne Duvenage. Professor Madonsela talks about, and I'm paraphrasing her here, do not outsource that which is for public good. I thought you wanted to offer a comment or two on public transport, but where I'd like for you to then cascade to or move on to is the criminal justice system. How well has government done in making sure that those who commit crime go to jail and pay for what they've done?
Yeah. Just on public transport, I think we just let down society so badly. The poorest of the poor through spatial development and the apartheid years of, they have the furthest to travel, and we really should have taken care of making sure the access to freedom of movement was addressed. And this move from rail to road is sad, and it's very costly, and it's costing this economy. And we've got to be very careful not to fall into the trap of outsourcing and get back to government doing the work that it should be doing with our taxes. So I agree with Thuli Madonsela there. On the criminal justice system, we're in a very, very dangerous position right now. The crime syndicates are infiltrating all levels of government. The whole construction mafia is just hijacking the construction industry. We really do not feel safe in our homes, and I'm talking everybody here. Again, the poorest of the poor suffer the most. Middle class and wealthy people have their security systems and armed responses, but we just do not trust the police anymore, and that's a very, very precarious and dangerous place to be. Our murder rates, our gender-based violent rates just continue to spiral upwards. And yes, there's a dip now and then, but off a very, very bad base. We should never be where we are right now. So I think this is one of the biggest areas that the Government of National Unity need to address. We need to get professionalism into our policing systems. And we need to start ensuring that accountability is now meted out, that we round up the thugs and the mafias and deal with this decisively, while at the same time, crime continues in the public space as well as the private sector. Private sector is the other side of the corruption coin. It's not just in the state; it's somebody else has to do these transactions with the state where corruption happens. And yet we see no accountability. We see lack of transparency. We see so much hard work that has to be put into getting information. We have to go to court sometimes to get basic information. So this lack of transparency leads to this criminal justice system collapsing. And I think one thing we can call on from this new government or this government of national unity is to ensure that there is now transparency. Information needs to be freely available. That's what should be available so that we can start putting our eyes and ears onto where the problems are and holding government to account. There's a lot of work to be done in that space.
Professor Friedman, can I exploit this topic a little bit more? I think that's a very worrying statement from Wayne Duvenage when he says the people have lost trust in the police. We just don't trust the police anymore. What can be done to regain that trust?
Well, I would slightly disagree. I mean, much of what he describes is very true. My only disagreement with him would be that I don't think most people in this country have ever trusted the police. And that's not just to make, that's not just to be cute. White people, some white people look back at the apartheid era and they say, isn't it wonderful? We had a fine police force. Research has shown that under apartheid, the South African police force, as it was then called, had 1 out of 10 officers engaged in fighting crime. The other 9 were busy policing apartheid and doing all sorts of administrative tasks, etc. So I'm afraid protecting citizens in the way that Wayne Duvenage described, which I agree with entirely, and he's absolutely right to say that this is a problem for everybody, because I think if township businesses were better protected, we would see the effects. We would see the effects in growth in the economy. So really, what we have to do is acknowledge that we've never had a police force which has protected the people, and to start having a serious look at how we can improve that. And one thing I think we could start with is that, I think in a democracy, whether it's policing or any of the other public services, as I said earlier, making sure that the people are part of the process is very important. And we've had community police forums operating for many years. And my observation is that, wherever these forums operate, they're not actually vehicles for the people to tell the police what they want. They are vehicle for the people, for the police to use the community police forum to do public relations, so that the people on the community police forum, instead of being people who say to the police, I may be generalizing to an extent, but that's the general rule, instead of people who say to the police, look, you're not doing this for us and you're not doing that for us, are generally people who go out and tell everybody how wonderful the police are doing, even when it's quite clear that they're not. Mm-hmm. So if we look at the way in which citizens can become part of actually holding the police to account, that would help. But I think one of the problems we have, I talked right at the beginning about the things we didn't do in the 1990s. In the 1990s, there was actually a lot of very interesting research done on how to fix the police force, and it wasn't acted on. So it's not as if we have to start from scratch. If you go back to some of the things that were submitted to government at the time, there are a lot of very good ideas there about how we can make the police force more efficient. Unfortunately, for the political reasons that we've all been talking about, it was never dealt with. But now would be a good time to dust those ideas off and start applying them.
Professor Matontela, as we taper down, we're wrapping now, I want to circle back to the question of the national dialogue. Professor Friedman referred to it a little earlier, and he seemed to suggest that this may be one way of actually managing this difficult coalition, because he refuses to call it a government of national unity. And he says this will allow them to govern for 5 years. You are a legal mind. I asked this question of President Mbeki just close to the election day, whether there should be a legal framework that governs whatever coalition agreement or whatever GNU agreement is signed by these parties. And he very straight out said, separate politics from the legalese. Where do you stand?
Well, Oli, President Mbeki might know better than me as an astute politician who was involved in the 1994 negotiations. But as a social activist and as a lawyer, I do think that a legally binding agreement could be best for two reasons. The first part is the agreement needs to be anchored in the Constitution, and because of that, it needs to be scrutinized by the state law advisor. The second reason is whatever agreement is entered into, it does interfere with the normal running of state affairs. And if it's legally binding, it becomes easier for anybody to seek to make sure that it is adhered to and it is enforced. But having said that, I would agree with President Mbeki and everyone else about the need to separate state and party, because these agreements at the moment are entered into by political parties. If we make it a legally binding agreement, we will then have to consider, is this an agreement between parties in parliament, which then becomes part of the parliamentary system? And if so, then it becomes a stronger legal document. But no strong legal document is going to compensate for poor leadership. I think the leaders will have to accept, do they agree with the vision in the Constitution? Do they agree with the values in society? Do they agree with the people entitlements in the Constitution, the character of the state, and the accountability frameworks? And do they agree to deal with each other ethically, respecting each other's integrity and respecting the fact that they're equals? I do feel that sometimes when they talk to each other, they talk at each other, and there's a sense of not recognizing each other as equals.
All right.
And they'll have to do that.
Professor Matontshela, unfortunately, you become the person who has the last word. Wayne Duvenage, I would have really loved to discuss with you the Directors General and that role between them and the political head. But we're completely out of time. I want to thank you all for your participation this evening. It's been a great discussion indeed. Wayne Duvenage from Outer, Professor Thuli Matontshela, thank you very much for your time. A former public protector, and Professor Stephen Friedman, political analyst, thank you indeed for your contributions tonight. All right, and that's where we wrap it up for this Sunday. Up next, Thabo Mdluli with In Focus. Bye for now.